It's a pleasure to introduce Jonathan Mawdsley. I had the pleasure to work with Jonathan at the Heinz Center, where I spent 3 years. Jonathan started there in 2006, really trying to bring in some of the wildlife, natural resource issues in the State of the Nation ecosystems work, which is really one of the really unique products that for the nation really represented a documentation of the status of ecosystems services, ecosystem condition across the nation and for the nation. And Jonathan was part of that team led by Robin O'Malley. Jonathan received degrees from Harvard. He has a PhD from Cornell in entomology. He's really been a leader at the Heinz Center and I guess in the community and looking at invertebrate interactions with various global change dynamics. His work has led him to efforts in South Africa and Africa, looking at invertebrates there and documenting how those are being impacted by global change. He and I, with Robin O'Malley, worked on a number of issues related to climate change and wildlife conservation strategies being developed in the United States. He's been really driving a lot of the development in state planning with state natural resource and wildlife managers to develop their state plans for climate change management strategies for their states. Recently, he started working with tribal lands and Native Americans, and I think some of that will be included in this talk about the efforts there of working with Native Americans in their natural resource and conservation planning for their lands. So it's a great pleasure to let John take over.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you. It's great to be here. Sorry, I just clicked forward and I don't have an immediate way to go backwards, but the talk is about adaptive management and wildlife indicators. And that's been my business, the thing that I do with my life for the last 6 years professionally at the Heinz Center. Before that, I was at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is a grant-making agency in Washington, D.C., and I was there for about 5 years. Before that, I did a PhD in entomology and did a postdoc with Terry Irwin at the Smithsonian. So my path into wildlife management has been a little bit different than most people, but it's been a very rewarding experience, and I want to share with you some of the different activities we've been doing at the center. And you heard the words adaptive management in the title, and for most people, adaptive management usually refers to something like this. This is from a group called the Conservation Measures Partnership. It's basically a partnership between all the big environmental NGOs, the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, etc., and the group called Foundations of Success. And basically the steps in adaptive management are you determine what the problem is, you identify the problem, you select your targets, you do some planning, you identify the monitoring that needs to happen, you actually do the conservation work, you do the monitoring, you use the information from monitoring to learn, and then you use that in deciding and looking at what you've done and deciding how to change that in the future. At the Heinz Center, we've mainly been focusing on this side of the wheel, which is the side everybody tends to focus on, really. And that's the side having to do with conservation planning, the development of monitoring programs, and the implementation of conservation actions and monitoring programs. And my work has been mainly with wildlife monitoring, but the center itself has a long history of working with broader ecosystem monitoring issues, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The Heinz Center, as Dennis mentioned, is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. We reside on Farragut Square, which is lovely in the springtime and every time except for the summer, really. It's a think tank or scientific policy research institute is a longer word for it. This is our new logo, which is very orange, and we kind of have been going through a rebranding process. The center was established in 1996 by Teresa Heinz, now Teresa Heinz Carey, in memory of her late husband, H. John Heinz III, who was killed in a plane crash in 1991. And he was a senator for the state, a Republican senator from the state of Pennsylvania, and he believed very strongly that what we needed to do to solve environmental problems in society was to bring together people from different sectors. So from the business sector, the economic sector, the environment sector, scientists, academia, and so forth, the nonprofit organizations, to really try to deal with difficult environmental issues. The center, as I said, has been around since 1996. Its signature program during most of its life has been this thing called State of the Nation's Ecosystems, which is a nationwide effort coordinated by the White House science agencies, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Council on Environmental Quality, and so forth. And this actually began life under the Clinton administration. It began life as Al Gore's environmental scorecard. He wanted to have a report card on the environment for the United States. And it took various iterations, and by the time it got to the Heinz Center, it was focused pretty clearly on ecosystems and status questions only, not management questions, not ecosystem services per se, but just how are ecosystems doing and how can we answer that using existing monitoring data. And the overall process involved over 300 experts from academia, government, business, the nonprofit. Anyone with a stake in ecosystem management was brought into the project at some point or another. It published 2 big reports, which are both available online. The one on the right is by Island Press. The one on the left is Cambridge University Press. And we certainly have plenty of copies of the one on the left if people are interested. And you can get both of them online. The project really wound down in 2008 with the advent of the Obama administration. And there has been interest on the part of the Obama administration within the past, I would say, 18 months in reviving this in some form with more of a focus on ecosystem services. So, as they say in Monty Python, it's not dead yet. So, the 2002 edition, they were basically building this thing from scratch, and they were looking for a set of environmental indicators for the nation, ecosystem indicators to be precise. And so they had a group of senior advisors, very senior level people, the conservation field, and folks on the Capitol Hill, folks in the various federal agencies. And then there was this group called the Design Committee, which basically subbed all of the work out to these different task groups. And each task group was assigned the job of picking a set of environmental indicators related to fresh waters in the United States, related to urban and suburban landscapes, related to grasslands, related to forests, related to coasts and oceans. They were given the charge, if you could only measure 10 things, what would those 10 things be? And so they sort of, it grew a little bit, and I think in the end we ended up with about 100 indicators, which is about 20 per division. But it was a first attempt at coming up with a set of ecological indicators for the nation. Now, in the United States, we use indicators for a lot of different things. You may be aware of the economic indicators, things like housing starts and employment numbers and so forth. And what this was trying to do was trying to build a set of ecological indicators that people could use for managing the environment and managing ecosystems. By the time the 2008 edition rolled around, the group was pretty comfortable with a core set of indicators, and so they started looking at some of these areas that hadn't necessarily been covered, things like non-native or invasive species, carbon storage, biological condition, stream flows, and things like that. There were specific indicator design efforts that were sponsored as part of this. And then there was this group called the Strategic Marketing Committee, which realized that this thing needed to find a relevance and a home and a use if it was going to continue on. Some of the successes of the project: it generated 2 major reports and many smaller publications. It was essentially a proof of concept that we could actually all come together as ecological scientists and come up with a set of indicators or measures of our ecosystems that would be useful in some ways for managing the ecosystems that we have in the United States. The report and the project did a great job of engaging with the scientific community. It also did a great job of engaging with the federal agencies, the people who collect data, the people who report on ecosystem condition at smaller levels and who use this data in their decision-making processes. What it didn't do quite so well, the links to public policy decisions were not entirely clear. It wasn't clear how someone in the high levels of the White House or someone in Congress would take this information and be able to actually make some sort of management decision about it. In fact, the whole idea of a user community, who was actually going to use the information in the report, was not particularly well defined. There was a lot of upfront thinking about how to design this right, but there wasn't a whole lot of thinking about who was actually going to use it in the end. There are also some practical things that came up with this. The funding was very much dependent on the White House, and it survived the transition from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, but it didn't survive the transition from Bush to Obama. The Obama administration had their priorities. They were much more interested in climate change and actually doing things rather than just reporting on the state of the environment. The other thing that happened with this is that we found it was very challenging to get the private sector involved in terms of funding this. What we heard from a lot of private sector funders is this is a public good. This is something the government should be doing. We don't want to put our money into it because the government should be funding it. So that's some of the challenges. As I mentioned, the project has been on something of a hiatus for the past couple years, but there is interest in the Obama administration now in revitalizing something along these lines, but having to do more with ecosystem services rather than just the status of ecosystems in general. The next project I wanted to talk about is one that I actually developed at the center, and our marketing people gave it the name Pioneering Performance Measures, but it's really about identifying indicators for tracking the results of wildlife conservation activities on lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And for those of you who know the federal land family, the BLM is often the orphan stepchild. Everyone focuses on the national parks or the national forests, but the BLM has about 11% of the total landscape in the United States. And out here in the West, it's pretty sizable. Some states like Nevada is 67% BLM land. And the thought was that if we brought together the folks who are managing the landscapes, the folks from BLM, and the folks who are managing the wildlife from the state wildlife agencies, we could get together and talk about some of these things like shared priorities for management. What are people dealing with in both the wildlife management arena and the landscape ecosystem management arena? And we chose monitoring as the nexus for this because there's a lot of monitoring that goes on BLM lands. A lot of it is very project specific. It's designed to answer specific questions about whether a particular project was successful or not. And we felt that there was an opportunity here to repurpose some of that effort and repurpose some of the data to answer bigger questions about how ecosystems are doing and how landscapes are doing. And I'll get to some of the really important questions, like are the work that BLM folks are doing on public lands actually benefiting the wildlife that they're attempting to manage for. So this project got started in about 2008. And the process, this is something that actually Barry Noon in the back of the auditorium was involved in. We had a separate project that was funded by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation to look at the state wildlife action plans. And we were tasked with coming up with a process for identifying management indicators, monitoring systems and management indicators. And this is what we distilled from that particular effort. First of all, it needs to be collaborative, multi-sectoral. You have to have the people who manage landscapes, the people who manage habitat, as well as the people who manage wildlife in the room. You start by identifying what are called conservation targets. That's a word that means many different things to many different people. In this context, we use it similarly to the way the Nature Conservancy uses it, which is the subject of a conservation action. And that it can be a landscape, it can be a specific site, it can be a species, it can be a watershed, and so forth. And we're identifying targets for management that are going to be the subject of monitoring efforts. Then we build these conceptual models, and this is a very simple exercise that involves Post-it notes and sticky dots and things like that for each target that shows causal relationships between the target itself and the various threats, stressors, factors that influence it in the conservation actions. And then we ask the management community which of these are the most important things for you to be tracking, key rates, states, and processes. And we identify indicators, potential measures for each of those. And then we go and look at the monitoring activities that are going on within that particular landscape, that particular area of interest. And we try to identify which of them would match up with the particular indicators that people have chosen. We tested this out in Nevada starting in 2008. And this is actually a really great test case if you want to work with the BLM because 67% of the land in the state is managed by the BLM. It's also nice in that there's very large areas of the state that have similar vegetation cover. There's a lot of big sagebrush, for example. There's a lot of Mojave Desert scrub that's fairly similar. The Bureau of Land Management and its partners, we got together with them in early 2008, and we had about 40 people in the room. They selected 3 targets, sagebrush ecosystems, springs and springbooks, which are the source of water in these very arid, very desert landscape, dry desert landscapes, and then the Mojave Desert at the southern end of the state, the area down around Clark County and Las Vegas. And we actually were, for the sagebrush ecosystems, we were able to develop a monitoring pilot that set out a series of monitoring stations across that broad landscape so that we were able to start making inferences about what was happening across that broader landscape to a range of different wildlife species. I'll just show you this right now. This was actually from the group that Barry was involved in. This was a conceptual model, and you see in the middle we've got the target, and then the arrows are causal arrows. Climate change affects the sage ecosystem, invasive species affect it. And then the green boxes, which don't really show up so well in this particular projection, are the different types of activities that Nevada Department of Wildlife or the BLM could use to address various of the threats and stressors that have been identified. So you've got invasives control, you have grazing management, better land use planning, recreational policies and management, and immediate fire response. And so what we did was to identify indicators on the landscape for each of these particular types of threats and stressors, and then response measures to track what we were actually doing on the land. This is another cool thing that came out of this. I just wanted to share this with you because this was how we were able to implement the monitoring efforts on the ground. You've got several different types of monitoring overlaid on basically a fairly modest area. This green Christmas tree thing in the middle, it's got an axis across the base and then two axes and then a vertical axis there. That's a standard BLM vegetation monitoring plot. And over that we've overlaid bird sampling transects, small mammal traps, Sherman traps, and pitfall traps for herps. And what this enables you to do is you can set these out and have a group of graduate students in a pickup truck literally go around and sample them over the course of a summer. And that was how we were able to make this particular sampling effort work. So why this particular test case worked as well as it did, we had a very small number of actors. The BLM managed most of the land in the state, and between the Department of Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy, they managed most of the wildlife in the state. So you literally could get everyone in the room together and have a productive conversation about how we're going to manage these landscapes, what our priorities are, what we're going to monitor, and so forth. There's also a limited number of vegetation communities in the state. It's not terribly ecologically complex. It's not like Southern California or Arizona, other states like that. And most importantly, we had a little bit of follow-on funding available from the BLM to do the monitoring pilot. And again, it was not a lot of money that enabled us to put graduate students out into the field to sample a very large area of the state for very little money. So the Bureau of Land Management really liked that, and they decided that they wanted to throw a lot of money at it to try to replicate it. And so we've been very determinedly trying to do that in various other states across the western United States. The first one out of the box was the state of Utah, and here BLM is still a substantial owner, but there's also a lot of state land, there's also an awful lot of private land and other federal land. And in this one we tried a different tack. Rather than getting everyone in the same room, we tried getting all of the leadership for the various agencies together in the first part of the planning process, and then turning it over to the field monitoring staff. And what we discovered pretty quickly on is that Utah had developed their own integrated monitoring program. They had a very large statewide watershed initiative that was was restoring water quality across the state. And what they had done was to take the same sort of little sampling frames that we had been working with independently in Nevada and use those to do pre and post sampling. And so what they've been doing is doing the statistical analyses to figure out what other types of inference they might be able to make about larger change on the landscape driven by climate, driven by invasive species, driven by fire, driven by other stressors, human development, and so forth, using the existing network of monitoring approaches. So we were able to validate what they were doing. We had experts in the room who said, yeah, this is basically the right thing to do. The other thing we found is that there's also a lot of other data out there that even Utah Division of Wildlife, the BLM, and their partners weren't already aware of. There's a lot of work that goes on within academic institutions, for example. There's a lot of work that's being done by nonprofits, a lot of bird monitoring, for example, that's done by nonprofits, that we were able to help connect the dots and get people to think about how to use some of these data in a more to get a more comprehensive picture of what's going on in the Utah landscapes. Next, we moved to Arizona, and we did this literally the week after Utah, which I don't recommend. It's a very exhausting process, and to do them back-to-back was pretty tough on our staff. In Arizona, the Game and Fish Department is very strongly focused on endangered species management. Now, yes, they have the Big Game Management Division, but the folks we were working with were a lot of their work was funded by endangered species management funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So they had a lot of funding to do things like desert tortoises and pupfish and other good things like that. Then they had a lot of data, presence, absence data on various endangered species. They even had some population estimates, and they had adequate sampling design. And what we started to do with them, we took this area of the state, this sort of area from like Tucson up to Phoenix and down along here where there's a lot of ongoing stress both from drought and from human transmigration and things like that. And we began the process of developing a GIS analysis that looked at all the endangered species monitoring sites. And we started to talk about what other types of monitoring you could add at those sites, vegetation monitoring being an obvious one, but also looking at human use and human incursion and things like that to try to get more of a comprehensive picture of what was going on in the landscape. The other thing we encountered in Arizona was that the state was under pressure from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to actually develop a chapter on climate change for their state wildlife action plan. And so we were able to help them with that. We compiled a bunch of information from the literature, and we also went through a variety of exercises with them to talk about what species were at highest risk and what vegetation communities were at greatest risk. Wyoming was the next state that we moved to, and we happened to hit a good time. The timing was excellent for our work in the state of Wyoming. They had just completed their state wildlife action plan revisions, and the state wildlife agency viewed this topic of monitoring and evaluation as being a great opportunity for them to build partnerships and coalitions, specifically with BLM. And they chose their targets in advance. Here again, sagebrush was a major concern, a major driver for doing this work. And this ended up being a fairly small number of people who participated in the workshop, but what that meant was we were able to have very focused discussions, and one of the key lessons learned from this is that getting the right people in the room matters a great deal. And as a result, there was increased dialogue between the BLM and the State Wildlife Agency, which has led to ongoing projects and ongoing collaboration. Some other states, this model has not transferred as well, and I think one of the things we in the conservation community need to do is to analyze sometimes why things don't work the way that we sometimes would like them to. In Oregon, they had already gone through a very similar process with conceptual modeling and indicator selection, and they had run into a problem with data sharing. Basically, people were not collaboratively sharing data in the state of Oregon, and that's not something that our process specifically would address. That's okay. There are other ways to deal with that, and they found other mechanisms to deal with that, but they had already gone through a lot of the steps that we would have done with them. In the state of New Mexico, there was a change in the governorship, and there was a refocusing of the efforts within the particular state wildlife agency, and so even though the BLM was interested, the state wildlife agency was not. Likewise, in Colorado, we've been told this is not a priority for the state wildlife agency. And so even though the BLM would be interested in doing this, right now the Colorado Parks and Wildlife are not. State of Washington, we had really strong interest on the part of their state fish and game director. The problem is there's too little BLM land in the state to be of national BLM interest. So there's a case where the BLM isn't interested, but the state is. And in Idaho and Montana, they've been involved in another project with the Western Governors Association that's looking at wildlife corridors. And they have limited bandwidth, limited capacity within their state wildlife agency to be able to take on additional work. That's one of the key things we learned about working with the state wildlife agencies is that generally they can take on about one major project at a time, and you have to kind of get in the queue and hit the sweet spot. And if there's a planning window or there's something like that, you can get in there and do a lot of good work. But if not, you have to kind of get in the queue and wait your time out. And we've actually had changeover in the leadership of the wildlife office at the Bureau of Land Management in Washington, D.C., And one of the good things we've been hearing from them is that they're viewing this as a long-term ongoing process rather than just a one-off doing a bunch of workshops in a bunch of states. So that's actually very encouraging. And we will continue to wait some of these situations out, and we'll see what happens, as administrations change. And here in Colorado, you had Parks and Wildlife merging. As things like that happen, we'll see what happens, and we'll be there ready to work with the state wildlife agencies when they have the opportunity. At the national level, the Bureau of Land Management is very interested in identifying a set of indicators for assessing progress of all of their conservation activities across all of their landscapes. And this takes the form of this AIM assessment, inventory, and monitoring program. And it's kind of like State of the Nation's ecosystems, but for the BLM. And they're looking at a broad suite of indicators, terrestrial, freshwater, aquatic, and wildlife indicators, to assess the efficacy of the management activities that they're doing across the entire BLM lands in the entire western United States. And we have been working specifically on the wildlife indicator portion of this. And our workshop series, the 4 workshops we've had to date, plus a number of other similar efforts, we've reviewed over 600 possible indicators for wildlife management. And what we found was very interesting is that there's a set of core indicators that tend to turn up across the board in different ecosystems, regardless of what the specific conservation issue is. And so we've been refining that set. And what we're going to do with the Bureau of Land Management, we'll have a very focused workshop where we bring in a few outside experts, folks who have done this in other agencies such as the Park Service, the Forest Service, academic experts, and really come up with a set of core wildlife indicators for tracking the progress of wildlife management on BLM lands. And this is pretty exciting for us. We'll be able to help contribute to the management of 11% of the U.S. land base and helping to make sure that wildlife populations are being adequately monitored and tracked over time. So this is a pretty exciting thing that's actually going to happen here right after the first of the year. The last thing that I wanted to share with you today is some really exciting work we've been doing with the Navajo Nation. And this was something that came up completely serendipitously. And I think another important lesson is that you just have to be open for these great little opportunities as they come along. At our workshop in Phoenix with the Heinz Center, the Bureau of Land Management, Arizona Game and Fish, Gloria Tom, who's the director of Navajo Fish and Wildlife, came up to me and said, "I'd like you to lead our strategic planning workshop." And I said, "Sure, that'd be great." So we actually worked, I have a team of people who work with me, and we came down to several different workshops that they had and helped them develop their first ever 10-year strategic plan. Previously, they'd been doing planning on a year-to-year basis, and what this is doing is helping them set some long-term goals and also address some larger-scale problems, larger-scale issues, things like invasive species and climate change that are radically affecting the Navajo landscape, but that are hard to address when you just are doing planning from year to year. And so what we did, it's very similar to the process for the BLM workshops. We identified a set of targets, focal plant animal species, and also focal areas, what they called habitats. But I think focal areas is probably more correct, where they're going to do the long-term conservation focus. Now, they still have conservation targets that they're working on an annual basis, but we're looking at longer-term conservation targets. One of the neat things about this planning effort is that we were able to incorporate cultural significance as well as ecological and economic significance. And they were very generous in sharing a lot of information with us about the significance of particular animal and plant species and why they were important. And the integration between ecological and traditional knowledge is a really neat part of this particular planning effort. So what we did was we had a series of workshops. I think we've had 3 so far where we had everybody in the whole department from the director all the way on down. That's about 42, 43 people, plus a few key contacts in other agencies, people in the tribal government, people in the Navajo Forest Service, people in the Department of Agriculture, and so forth. We did a collective brainstorming exercise to identify all the possible priorities that were out there: plants, animals, landscapes, fish, birds, etc., insects. And then we did a voting exercise by the entire group to determine what the highest priorities are going to be for the department overall. And as part of this exercise, we also went through and we identified all the elements you would need to do to build the conceptual model from our earlier efforts: the threats, stressors, different factors influencing the targets, different current potential conservation actions, if there's monitoring activities going on, and so forth, for each of the priority species in the landscapes. Priority animal species, golden eagle, the feathers are used in traditional headdresses and other purposes by the Navajo. The mule deer, it's literally every part of the deer is used in some way by Navajo people. Desert bighorn sheep is a animal for which they have a trophy hunt every year on the reservation. The population is healthy and is actually growing, which is quite remarkable. Mountain lion made the list because they have them. They are hunted, but nobody knows much about mountain lion. They don't have population numbers. They don't have a good sense of how many they have or don't have. And then black bear is another animal of very potent traditional tribal significance for the Navajo people. Plant species, several of these, yucca, sage, pinyon pine, are used in traditional ceremonies. The Mesa Verde cactus is a federally listed cactus species that occurs nowhere else but on the Navajo reservation, and it's something for which Navajo Fish and Wildlife has the primary lead for recovery, so it's one of their priority plant species. And then salt cedar with the effects on riparian areas and wet areas and so forth across the landscape. So you have invasives as well as traditional plants as well as threatened and endangered plant species. And then the landscapes and sites that they picked, they have a network of biological preserves, and rather than picking any one of them, we just said let's treat them all as a set. And it's actually about 10% of the Navajo landscape, so it's not bad in terms of overall percentages, and it covers a lot of these very sensitive areas, places where they have endangered cacti and rare vegetation communities, and the areas where the bighorn sheep are active and things like that. Mountain ponds and springs. We spent a lot of time at our workshop talking about climate change and how it played out across the Navajo landscape, and they clearly identified mountain ponds and springs as something they were already seeing changes in and that they wanted to keep an eye on. Likewise, high elevation mountain grasslands and meadows, they were seeing those starting to get invaded and changing already, and that's something that they are very interested in, not just from a wildlife management perspective, but those are also areas where people graze sheep and other livestock. Pinyon juniper woodlands are important to the Navajo people because of various resources that are found there. And then the fishing lakes. You have to remember this department exists because there are huntable, fishable species on the Navajo landscape as well as threatened and endangered species. And so they wanted to make sure that the conservation planning had really addressed these lakes, some issues related to overuse as well as sedimentation and things like that. So why this particular process worked, the Navajo Department of Fish and Wildlife viewed this as a great success. We basically were able, again, to pull in everyone who had some kind of responsibility for wildlife management into the process. And this included everyone from the director all the way down to the part-time staff people who were helping out doing censuses for mule deer and bighorn sheep. In general, we found that the staff of the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife knew the landscape and its wildlife extremely well. If you asked them, what are you seeing on the landscape as a result of climate change? You get a long list of things that are starting to change, observations that they've made. If you want to know where to see mountain lion, where to see mule deer, they know that. They know where the black bears are denning. This is just general knowledge that people have because they're out living on the landscape and in touch with the landscape in a way that a lot of us in more Western societies have lost. And the group was able to come to clear consensus on the list of targets, and everyone really rallied around these once they had been selected. It felt good, felt that these were culturally as well as ecologically appropriate. The last thing I'll talk about is a project we're currently working on with Navajo Department of Fish and Wildlife, looking at climate change in the Navajo landscape. And the projections are pretty similar for the rest of the Southwest. It's going to get hotter and drier. There'll be less snowpack, more winter rain. The seasonal rains, the summer monsoons, are going to get more intense and perhaps less frequent. Increases in drought severity and increases in fire frequency and intensity. And so we've been working with them. We've already had one vulnerability workshop to start the process of thinking about what this means for their landscape and for their wildlife species and what they might be able to do about it. And this is a slide taken directly from the vulnerability workshop. We'll start with the vulnerability assessment, understand risks and challenges, and then we'll move into adaptation planning, where we'll try to integrate notions related to climate change into routine natural resource management. It just becomes part of what Navajo Department of Fish and Wildlife does as part of its everyday business. Taking climate change into account in decision making. It's just another thing to be taking account of as the department moves forward. And monitoring becomes very important here, monitoring to assess what's happening on the landscape, that sort of status monitoring, but also to judge the success of adaptation activities. And we're to the point where we're starting to discuss particular adaptation activities, and the department is going forward with the activities in parallel with monitoring efforts so that we'll be able to judge what's actually successful or not. So for the vulnerability assessment, we looked at resilience. We actually looked at resilience as well as vulnerability factors. You know, desert bighorn sheep can derive the water they need from food, making more resilient to changes in water availability. And you know, obviously mountain ponds and springs require winter snowpack, which makes them more vulnerable if there's less snowpack around. We gave the department this vulnerability worksheet, and it's based on the checklist that NatureServe developed, as well as other things that we felt were important that had been left out of that. At the top, you start with this exposure, and then you start with, continue on with aspects of species biology, things like dispersal ability, physical habitat specificity, whether it's dependent on interspecies interactions, anything that's been noted about population and genetic responses, and also critically temperature and precipitation sensitivity. So you've got the exposure factors at the top, and then these various things that interplay with various climate variables as part of the worksheet. And from the worksheet, we get these cool color-coded assessments based on, you know, whether there's a preponderance of things that are leaning towards vulnerability or a preponderance of things that are leaning towards resilience. So in the case of golden eagle, man-made barriers, specifically power lines, are a significant issue for the species, as are human interactions, where you have people harvesting feathers off of the birds and leading to mortality. Whereas some of the other things like dispersal ability, they fly. They're good at moving around. And diet, they're pretty unspecific when it comes to the things that they'll feed on. They're pretty Catholic in their dietary requirements. Likewise with temperature, they're able to deal well with a wide range of temperature regimes. So looking at the 5 species that the Navajo had selected as their priorities, you can see there's some of them that are in worse shape than others. Probably the one that fares the least well is the desert bighorn. The one that does the best is the mountain lion, but the mountain lion is driven in large part by data gaps. We simply don't know enough about that species on the landscape. And you saw the golden eagle earlier, but they sort of play out. Mule deer probably will be okay, although there are definitely declines in mule deer populations across the West. So it's something to look at. And then what this gives you is a quick, very easy way to visualize the different aspects of vulnerability and resilience within this one little table. And then for the adaptation planning part of this, we asked 2 questions. What is the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife doing currently that is going to be the right thing to do in response to climate change? What are we doing that will help animals, plants, and their habitats adapt successfully to changes in climate? And then what do we need to start doing? What changes do we need to make to our existing management that will help animals, plants, and habitats adapt successfully? One of the first things that came up in the discussion was identifying and protecting movement corridors. And they actually have a GIS staff person on the staff at Navajo Department of Fish and Wildlife. And they had previously done a map of all of the high priority conservation areas, these biological preserves and other key movement corridors. And they actually took that to the tribal government and said, these are areas that we want to protect, where we don't want to have development going on. We don't want to have this, drilling or coal mining or anything else, new housing developments go in these areas. The tribal government signed off on that. So there's actually a mechanism to protect movement corridors. And so what Dr. Erica Fleischman and a series of collaborators are working on right now is a connectivity analysis looking at the Navajo landscape and trying to identify movement corridors for these large mammalian species. And then that information will get fed back into the GIS that Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife maintains, and then it can be incorporated into the planning activities. Wildlife-human conflicts was mentioned in a number of cases. Certainly with black bear, that's an issue. Also with golden eagle. And you know as well as I do from the literature, if you reduce stress on the wildlife from other sources, it can lead to an extra resilience for dealing with climate change. And I'll conclude by talking a little bit about the Desert Bighorn Project. This is one of the big success stories for the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife. They started with 36 desert bighorn in the early 90s, and through careful protection and breeding and habitat restoration and so forth, they've been able to bring the herd up to about 300 animals, which allows them to have a hunt every year. And one of the things we're doing with Erica Fleischman's project is identifying movement corridors as well as refugia, places within the current distribution of the species on the Navajo landscape where it's likely to persist or it's likely to be able to move between particular areas that are of high quality habitat for it. Also, habitat management along those corridors. Once we've got the corridors identified, it becomes important to maintain them in some sort of condition that the sheep are able to use. Translocation has been used by the tribe twice already to move sheep to new habitats. And if you follow the conservation literature at all, you know there's an intense debate over whether or not we should be moving species is part of our response to climate change. The reality is Fish and Wildlife departments do this stuff all the time. And rather than arguing whether or not we should be doing it, we should be finding ways to do it better and smarter so that it's able to facilitate adaptation by species, rather than putting in places where they're not going to be able to survive in 50 or 100 years. And then the Navajo Nation has implemented a very aggressive program of monitoring for habitat variables that are required by the sheep. And they also have collars on the sheep, so they're tracking population responses. So this is a really nice integrated project looking at desert bighorn in particular and undertaking a variety of adaptation actions that came out of a planning process. So in conclusion, a few lessons learned. One of the key things we've learned is that the process by which we do this stuff, this sort of conservation planning, matters a lot, at least as much as the science. If you get the science right and the process wrong, it may not go anywhere. If you get the process right and the science right, it can be very powerful indeed. Monitoring programs come and go, and they really require dedicated sources of funding and dedicated staff in order for them to be able to survive. And this is at all levels, certainly at the state agency level, tribal agencies, as well as the federal agency. One of the things we found in the BLM work is that there's often a lot more monitoring data out there and available than you might think. When we started talking with state wildlife biologists, a lot of them said, well, we really can't do this because we don't have data on X. And a lot of times they're talking about vegetation data or change over time, data about the change of the landscape over time. And that's actually available in a lot of cases, either from satellite data or from academics or folks who have done various studies at USGS and other agencies. So part of what we've been trying to do with the state wildlife agencies is just getting folks to realize the wealth of data that's out there that they can use in their management activities. One of the key lessons learned from State of the Nation's ecosystems is it's really important to focus on uptake and implementation. Who's actually going to use the information coming out of the project? And for the last two projects, the BLM, the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife, there's strong commitment from the federal agency on one hand and the tribal agency to actually use the information in an adaptive fashion. And the last point, management decisions are not always based on science. We saw working with the Navajo the importance of cultural traditions and cultural sensitivities, and this certainly plays out at higher levels in Washington where decisions are not always based on science either. So with that, I think I will conclude, and thank you for your time.
Absorbed by the public
right.
Decision makers, we always fail miserably, but I think what you've illustrated is the importance of that interaction with partners and communication.
One of the key things that the Heinz Center has been working on is being able to translate science into formats that policymakers can actually understand. So a lot of us write, I'm a practicing scientist too, I maintain my own research program. When I write something up for an ecological journal, it's not the same kind of language I would take to someone on Capitol Hill or in the Fish and Wildlife Service even, or USDA Forest Service, for example. So.
Time for questions.
Questions, comments? Yes?
I have a question. You mentioned the WGA effort, the Western Governors Association.
Yes.
complementary to it? Is there overlap? Because that's a huge effort right now going on, and I would think they'd be incorporating BLM lands into what they're doing.
Oh, absolutely. It's very complementary. If you look at the way that they're designing their decision support systems, it's going to pull in information from a variety of sources. And what BLM is doing is sort of standardizing their monitoring across the agency so it could be taken up by WGA or by anybody else out there.
And so is BLM in this case, because I know one of the things that they were concerned about from state to state was just that everyone was even measuring things in a standardized way.
Yes.
So is that conversation happening?
Definitely. BLM they're getting down into the how do you measure these things on the landscape questions, and they're coming up with standard protocols. The assessment, inventory, and monitoring thing actually has a tiered step-down process going from national all the way down to on-the-ground measurement. What they're looking for are wildlife indicators that can fit in with that can be collected in the same way across larger landscapes. Mm-hmm. Those are the types of indicators we're looking at for that effort. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question about those indicators, and you showed in the Arizona one where you had, what was it, the bear, the mountain lion, mule deer in there.
Right.
So once you pick those as an indicator, now you're looking at some sort of enumeration of that population, and all of those are very difficult to sample, and you have a lot of process and sampling variation with those when you do that. So how are you handling that when, let's just say you pick mule deer,
right,
and you say, we're going to use mule deer as an assessment of these habitats, whether they're increasing in robustness and health or not. But yet mule deer populations change by huge magnitudes on an annual basis, and as we've seen over 100 years. So I'm missing the link between when you pick the species and you say you're going to monitor it, but we know these are very difficult to monitor. How do I know when I'm looking at noise versus reality?
Two things here. First of all, the mule deer example was not actually a monitoring target. That's a management target. That's a long-term management target that they're going to be focusing on as something that the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife wants to invest money in maintaining that population. There will be monitoring associated with that. Most likely it's going to be for some vegetation habitat parameters that are useful for the species that are easier to track than the numbers of the animals themselves. And speaking specifically about mule deer, when we did the Nevada pilot, there was a strong interest on the part of the state agency. They do all these overflights to do counts and things like that. There was a strong interest in including pellet counts, and we pretty much threw that out after about the first couple days because there's pellets everywhere. It's not a particularly useful measure to include on that small scale. So the first point, there's actually, they're still figuring out what the monitoring parameters are going to be for those, and it's likely not going to be the population count itself, because all of those animals are difficult to count, and that's.
Yeah, so I guess, so what are you looking at then? If they're difficult to count and they say, let's keep working on the mule deer one, they say, is it just generally that they'd like to have mule deer on the landscape for their nation and their people to utilize, and
that may be good enough. I mean, I think that's, for mule deer in particular, that's good enough. I mean, as long as someone can go out and hunt and get a deer that will sustain them through the winter, that's good. And that may be the threshold level for that. Yeah. Sure, Amber.
When working on the BLM project with different agencies, both federal and state, did you ever come across any sort of conflicts over who manages what in the different jurisdictions, and how did you deal with that?
That's a really good question. And one of the challenges, in fact, even putting the project together was that BLM, on the one hand, they need to know responses for wildlife to their management, and because the reason they're doing habitat management work is for wildlife, yet they don't actually manage the wildlife itself, except in certain scenarios, like up in Alaska, there's tribal land, certain areas that are tribal harvest lands where the BLM manages the wildlife. So bridging that gap and even getting the agencies, the state wildlife agencies and the BLM to sit down and say, you have part of the puzzle and I have part of the puzzle, getting them together was pretty significant. I would say a lot more of the conflicts have to do with just agency culture things. People do things in different ways, and a lot of these words that we use, adaptive management, targets, monitoring, inventory, assessment, every agency uses them in slightly different ways, and they can get really wrapped around the axle in trying to talk with each other. One of the other projects I'm working on right now is with the Forest Service, and BLM has AIM, Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring. At the Forest Service, it's Inventory, Monitoring, and Assessment. And they use the words, they both use the words indicators, but they use them in very different ways. And so people actually have the same language, but it can trip them up when they start to talk about what the specifics are. Yes?
Yeah, on the note of Forest Service, any applicability then to Forest Service parklands or even large private landowners like Turner's properties?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think we had a representative from one of the Turner ranches at the Arizona workshop. And I know they collaborate pretty well with a number of the different folks in Colfax County, New Mexico. So that's, there's definite applicability to other landscapes. The Forest Service is a bit further ahead in this. They've gone through a process where they've picked indicator species for a lot of their different vegetation communities, and they have a lot of monitoring efforts out on the ground, and what they're trying to do is create a cohesive framework that all of that fits into, so it all ties back to management questions, and then ultimately reporting back to Congress, the White House, and the American people as to what they're doing on Forest Service lands.
So Jonathan, one thing that really is a mark of the success of the Heinz Center and the work that you're representing is the policy neutral nature of the approach that you've taken, from the State of the Nation ecosystems all the way to this effort with Novel Nation. Is that although you're providing information to a broad set of sectors, you're not being policy prescriptive.
Right. Right.
And I think that's really important, and I think that for the academic community, that's a really strong message as well. And that's part of our comfort zone, actually, not being out there as an advocate.
That's right.
And I think the way that you frame things is really important. But that sort of almost it challenges us as researchers in the sort of fourth point about uptake and implementation, because as we then develop messages or develop the interpretation of these efforts, we start moving into that area of looking at trade-offs, evaluating things that can be used in the policy framework. And so there's that sort of tension zone between how we actually message or package information, interpret things, as well as developing the process.
I will say different scientists have comfort zones in different places. Some people are fine getting outside of your data if you can see the clear extrapolation. Other people will stick to what the data tell us and not go any further than that. And I think that's something that, as scientists, we each have to kind of grapple with these issues and come to our own place of comfort. And for us, we find there's a really great working space just being able to get the information lined up so that people who make the decisions at least have the information available. So they never have the excuse that, well, we didn't know that or we didn't realize that what was going on.
So with that, maybe catch the next question afterwards, but I think at this point we want to thank Jonathan again and maybe just one last announcement.